The camera cuts in mid-sentence, and the studio air freezes.
Kash Patel leans forward with that smirk only arrogance can sharpen, dropping a comment so brazen, so condescending, that Twitter would still be replaying it hours later.
Gasps ripple through the live audience. Some laugh in disbelief, others groan audibly.
You can feel the oxygen being sucked out of the room.
Representative Jasmine Crockett doesn't flinch.
Her eyes narrow, sharp, unblinking, unshaken. She's not just listening, she's calculating. It's the kind of pause that says, I heard you, and you're about to regret it. Behind her, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries tilts his head with a knowing smirk.
He doesn't intervene, doesn't lean in, because he knows what's coming.
It's the look of a man who has seen Crockett in action before, who knows her tongue can cut cleaner than any gavel.
But at this moment? Silence. Dead silence. You could hear a pin drop in the studio. Cameras linger on Patel, basking in what he thinks is victory.
The control room doesn't cut away, they know better than to move an inch when history is writing itself in real time.
And the audience at home? Phones light up. Screenshots explode across Twitter. Did he just say that to Jasmine Crockett? One tweet reads, racking up thousands of likes in seconds. The hashtag forms instantly.
People aren't just watching a debate, they're watching a collision.
This isn't policy talk anymore. It's theater. It's power versus presence.
It's a man betting on arrogance, and a woman sharpening dignity into a weapon.
The stage is set. Crockett leans forward slightly, lips parting, as if to speak, and then stops.
She lets the silence stretch.
She lets Patel sweat. She lets the audience lean forward in their seats.
The smirk on Patel's face falters, just barely.
And that's when you know, something seismic is about to drop. Because Jasmine Crockett doesn't just answer insults. She annihilates them.
And in the next breath, she'll turn this moment upside down, leave Patel scrambling for cover, and remind America that dignity, delivered with precision, always steals the last word.
But what happened next would flip the entire debate upside down and leave Jeffries scrambling.
This wasn't just a clash between two people on live television. It was something much bigger, a spark inside a storm, the kind of moment that reveals the tectonic shifts happening beneath the surface of American politics. For years, the old guard has held the microphone. Leaders like Hakeem Jeffries, polished, cautious, deliberate, the establishment's steady hand.
They've mastered the language of safe answers and careful sidesteps.
They know how to play the long game, how to maneuver within institutions that reward restraint over raw honesty.
But Jasmine Crockett represents something entirely different, and that's why this confrontation mattered.
She is part of a new wave of fearless truth-tellers, unafraid to pierce through political theater with sharp precision. She doesn't just enter the conversation, she changes its temperature.
And that night, the contrast couldn't have been sharper.
Jeffries sat in his chair, smirking at Patel's arrogance, confident in the game as it's always been played. Crockett, meanwhile, carried herself like someone who had no patience for the game at all. Where Jeffries measured optics, Crockett measured impact. Where Jeffries played chess, Crockett threw lightning.
That's why Patel's insult wasn't just offensive, it was clarifying. It became the test. Would this moment be swallowed up by the endless churn of political noise? Or would it carve out its own place in the story of who gets to define dignity in American life? Twitter already had the answer.
Clips circulated within minutes, stripped of context, reshared with fire emojis and captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." People who had never tuned into a congressional hearing were now glued to their screens. It wasn't just about Crockett versus Patel.
It was about a hunger for something real in an era of spin. The establishment versus the insurgent.
The carefully managed against the unapologetically authentic.
And the stakes?
The soul of political discourse itself.
Think about it, how many moments in our lifetime have been both shocking and clarifying in the same instant?
Usually, political theater fades within hours.
But here, you could feel it, this wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't just another clip. It was history in the making. And that's where the FOMO kicked in. If you missed it, you missed the spark.
You missed watching an old guard strategy crumble against the force of a new kind of courage. You missed the look on Patel's face when silence turned into suspense. You missed the electricity in Crockett's pause, the way she held the stage without even speaking.
Moments like this don't just happen. They define eras.
They separate the leaders who adapt from the leaders who fade into footnotes.
And in that silence, that single, breathless silence, you could feel the lines being drawn.
On one side, the establishment, represented by Jeffries, who thought he could referee the moment from his seat of experience. On the other, Crockett, who wasn't asking for permission to speak truth to power. She was demanding it, commanding it, seizing it. The stakes had been raised.
The audience knew it. The internet knew it.
And Patel himself, with that flicker of unease crossing his face, knew it too. This wasn't going to be another forgettable exchange in a crowded news cycle.
This was the kind of moment that forces everyone watching to pick a side.
And just when you thought it couldn't get more personal, Jeffries said the one thing that crossed the line. To understand why this confrontation felt so electric, you have to rewind the tape and look at the man sitting just behind Jasmine Crockett, Hakeem Jeffries. On paper, he is everything the political establishment admires.
Smooth delivery.
Razor-sharp suits. A carefully curated image of calm, competence, and control. He is the kind of leader who never sweats, never raises his voice, never shows a crack in the armor. That's his brand, the unflappable strategist, the man who always seems 3 steps ahead. The press calls him disciplined. Pundits say he's polished. To the untrained eye, Jeffries is the embodiment of stability in a political world addicted to chaos. But look closer, and you'll see something else.
Arrogance, dressed up as composure.
A quiet, calculating entitlement that lurks just beneath the veneer of professionalism.
Jeffries doesn't shout because he doesn't think he has to. His smirk isn't charm, it's dismissal. His stillness isn't serenity, it's superiority. This isn't a new pattern. His rise to power was built not just on his skills but on his ability to make others feel smaller, to remind them, without ever raising a finger, that he holds the cards. In private, colleagues whisper about the little digs, the subtle put-downs, the way Jeffries can weaponize a smile. He doesn't need to hurl insults, his condescension does the work. And that's why this moment mattered so much. Because while Patel's arrogance was loud and reckless, Jeffries' arrogance was colder, quieter, the kind that corrodes trust slowly over time. Patel was the spark, but Jeffries? Jeffries was the gasoline.
Think about how he has built his career. Every step of the way, Jeffries has leaned on discipline and optics.
When cameras roll, he delivers talking points with surgical precision.
When lights dim, he calculates the next move.
To his allies, he is dependable.
To his rivals, he is untouchable.
And to himself? He is indispensable.
But here's the truth, that kind of control comes at a price.
You can only hold the mask for so long before the cracks begin to show.
And Jeffries, for all his careful packaging, has let arrogance slip through more than once. He has been caught on hot mics muttering disdain for colleagues he publicly praises.
He has dismissed grassroots voices as noise while tweeting about unity.
He has talked about respecting institutions while maneuvering behind closed doors to silence dissent.
The public doesn't always see it, but those in the room do. And Crockett?
She has seen it firsthand.
She knows the difference between discipline and dismissal. Between leadership and ego.
Between composure and condescension. That's why her presence that night carried so much weight. Because for years, Jeffries has coasted on his reputation as the steady hand, the man who can't be rattled, who can't be shaken, who can't be challenged.
But Crockett wasn't there to play his game. She wasn't there to stroke his image.
She was there to tell the truth, unfiltered. And deep down, Jeffries knew it. That's why he smirked when Patel threw his insult, not because he was amused, but because he thought he could control what came next. He thought Crockett would do what so many others had done before, swallow the insult, smooth it over, keep the peace.
But arrogance blinds. And Jeffries' arrogance, that carefully hidden superiority, left him vulnerable. He underestimated her. He underestimated the moment.
He underestimated the hunger in the audience for someone unafraid to speak without permission. That's the tragedy of arrogance. It convinces you that the game will always go your way. That the script will always follow the lines you've written. That everyone else will play their role while you hold the spotlight. But what Jeffries didn't count on was that Jasmine Crockett had receipts, fire, and dignity on her side. To understand why Jasmine Crockett owned that moment, you have to know where she came from, because nothing about her journey suggests she was ever meant to bow, to fold, or to bite her tongue. Her fire wasn't born in the spotlight. It was forged long before, in the quiet battles most people never see. Crockett grew up far from the marble halls of Washington. She wasn't raised with silver spoons or family dynasties. She was raised on grit, community, and the kind of lessons only struggle can teach. In neighborhoods where opportunities were rationed and justice didn't always show up on time, she learned that survival itself required courage. That courage, once sharpened, became her trademark. Before she ever set foot in Congress, Crockett's battleground was the courtroom. As a public defender, she sat across from people society had already written off. She listened to stories no one else wanted to hear. She fought cases where the odds were stacked, where the easy choice would have been to look the other way. But easy choices don't change lives. And for Crockett, silence was never an option. Day after day, she stood between her clients and the machinery of a system designed to grind them down. She wasn't naive about the uphill fight. She knew the law wasn't blind. She knew bias had a pulse. And yet, she pushed back anyway, armed with nothing more than her preparation, her persistence, and that unmistakable fire in her voice. That fire didn't just win cases. It won respect. Even prosecutors who opposed her in court admitted they never saw her back down. Judges noticed the intensity. Clients noticed the humanity. And soon, communities noticed the difference. Here was someone who fought like every case mattered, because to her, it did. But Crockett's path wasn't just professional, it was personal. She'd seen enough in her own life to know what it meant to be underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. She carried the weight of those experiences with her, not as baggage, but as fuel. Every slight, every barrier, every time someone tried to tell her she didn't belong became another spark in the fire. That's why, when she entered politics, people rallied. Not because she spoke like a politician, but because she didn't. She spoke like someone who had lived the struggle she was describing. She didn't memorize talking points, she lived them. And when she said she was fighting for her community, you could hear the courtroom in her voice. You could hear the urgency of someone who'd seen lives ruined by indifference. Authenticity like that is rare. In a world of polished statements and cautious phrasing, Crockett's bluntness was refreshing. She wasn't afraid to call things what they were. She wasn't afraid to get loud when others whispered. She wasn't afraid to put dignity above decorum. And people loved her for it. That's what makes her such a magnetic figure. She doesn't just argue. She embodies her arguments. Every gesture, every inflection, every pause feels rooted in something deeper, the story of someone who has fought too hard to waste words. She doesn't posture. She doesn't pander. She tells the truth, and lets the chips fall where they may. And that's why, in moments like the one with Patel, Crockett carries an undeniable weight. Because the audience isn't just seeing a congresswoman on camera. They're seeing the echoes of every courtroom battle, every injustice she refused to ignore, every moment she decided that silence wasn't acceptable. They're seeing the years of struggle compacted into a single, sharp edge of dignity. It's easy to cheer for someone who has earned their fight. And Crockett has. She didn't inherit her fire. She built it, blow by blow, case by case, moment by moment. She represents not just herself, but the countless voices she's defended, the communities she's uplifted, and the history she carries with pride. That's why Patel's insult hit differently. It wasn't just an attack on her, it was an attack on everything she represented. Every client she fought for. Every injustice she stood against. Every moment she refused to stay quiet. And Crockett knew it. You could see it in her eyes as the camera lingered. She wasn't about to let this pass. Because when you've lived her life, you don't just debate.
You don't just clap back. You defend, with the kind of fire that can turn a room upside down. And so, as Patel smirked and Jeffries played referee, Crockett did what she's always done. She sized up the arrogance, prepared her truth, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Which brings us back to the live TV stage, where the clash of styles would explode in real time. Back in the studio, the silence had ripened into something sharper: suspense. Patel leaned back in his chair, still smug, but the confidence looked a little too forced now, like a boxer trying to smile through a jab he didn't see coming. And just behind him, Hakeem Jeffries sat straighter, his smirk growing wider. He mistook Crockett's pause for hesitation. He thought this was his arena, his kind of debate, one where patience and control would smother passion. He thought she'd temper her fire to meet his rules. But Crockett wasn't playing by his rules. Her first words cut through the silence with deliberate calm, each syllable paced like a measured jab. Not shouting, not ranting, steady, precise, undeniable. The studio leaned in. Even Patel's smirk faltered, just enough to betray the first sign of doubt. Jeffries tried to interject, the way a seasoned politician does, with a condescending chuckle, a carefully worded "let's be civil here." But Crockett didn't yield. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply turned her gaze toward him, then back at Patel, and kept speaking with the kind of control that made his interruptions feel small, almost desperate. It became a rhythm, a duel. Jeffries with the smug interruptions, Patel with his scattered defenses, and Crockett holding the center of gravity like a fighter who knows she owns the ring. Every time Jeffries tried to brush her off, she countered with clarity. Every time Patel jabbed with arrogance, she slipped it and returned with precision. The audience could feel it, the shift in energy. What started as a staged debate was becoming something raw, unpredictable, and thrilling. You could see the crowd leaning forward, phones up, recording every second. Clips were already destined for social media, but the people in the room knew, being there in person meant witnessing something electric. Jeffries' smugness only grew more obvious as the exchange dragged on. His smiles stretched too long. His chuckles were too forced. He tried to play elder statesman, the seasoned operator above it all, but every time Crockett responded, the contrast deepened. She was grounded, authentic, sharp. He was posturing. He was losing. Patel, sensing the shift, tried to re-establish dominance. He leaned in again, voice rising, throwing barbs meant to rattle her. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward too, not aggressively, but with the kind of poise that says, "I am not moving. You move." The debate began to feel less like policy and more like sparring, one side throwing sloppy punches, the other side waiting, deflecting, landing clean countershots. And slowly, the crowd's loyalty shifted. The murmurs turned to cheers. The gasps turned to applause. Even Jeffries noticed. His smirk slipped for half a second as he realized, the room wasn't with him. The room was with her. Crockett seized that energy, her voice steady but rising just enough to ride the wave. She didn't attack for the sake of spectacle. She attacked with purpose, connecting her words to the deeper truths her supporters already knew: arrogance doesn't equal strength, dismissal isn't leadership, and dignity, when wielded with discipline, can feel like thunder. Jeffries tried again to regain footing, speaking over her, offering the polished one-liners he'd mastered over his career. But next to her authenticity, they landed flat. They weren't cutting, they weren't real, they were noise. And the audience could tell. The tension built like the middle rounds of a fight, jabs traded, defenses tested, both sides circling, waiting for the opening that would decide everything. Crockett kept her composure. Patel grew more agitated. Jeffries leaned harder on his smirk, trying to project dominance he no longer held. Everyone in that room, everyone watching at home, could feel the moment cresting. Something was about to land. The insult that sparked it all had lit the fire. The exchanges had stoked it hotter and hotter. Now the stage was ready for the blow that would burn into memory. And then came the line that would echo across America. The room was vibrating now, a mix of adrenaline and disbelief, as though everyone knew they were seconds away from a turning point. Patel still leaned forward, still trying to sell his arrogance as confidence.
Jeffries lounged in his chair, smirking, assuming control would inevitably return to him.
But Jasmine Crockett?
She sat steady, shoulders squared, eyes focused, the quiet before the storm. And then she spoke.
It wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed.
It was measured, like the careful aim of someone who knows one clean shot is worth 100 wild swings. You know what the problem is here, she began, her voice smooth, deliberate, letting the words hang.
The audience froze. Patel tilted his head. Jeffries smirked again, preparing his rehearsed response. But Crockett didn't give him the chance.
The problem, she said, pausing as the cameras zoomed closer, isn't just arrogance.
It's the assumption that arrogance equals authority. Gasps rippled across the room. Twitter feeds lit up instantly.
It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a diagnosis, a scalpel slicing straight to the core. Jeffries tried to laugh it off. Come on, he began, but Crockett raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to reclaim the floor.
And the remarkable thing? It worked.
The room respected her pause more than his interjection.
She pressed on.
You sit here, she said, looking directly at Patel, with your smirks and your insults, as if dismissing me will dismiss the truth. But what you fail to realize is this: I didn't get here by being quiet.
I didn't get here by waiting my turn.
I got here because I refused to let arrogance go unchallenged in courtrooms, in communities, and now, right here on this stage. The crowd erupted in applause, not polite, not restrained, real, visceral applause.
Even those who had stayed silent before couldn't help but react.
Jeffries' smile faltered, just slightly.
Cameras caught it.
The smirk that had been his shield all night was slipping. Crockett turned her gaze toward him now, the movement slow, deliberate. And you, she said, voice steady but sharp, have built a career on control.
On acting like silence is strategy. On letting arrogance pass because you think patience will clean it up later. But tell me, has that ever changed the reality for the people who don't get to wait? It was surgical. She wasn't just answering Patel's insult.
She was exposing Jeffries' entire persona, the smug superiority, the dismissive calm, the quiet arrogance that had defined his brand. And for the first time that night, Jeffries blinked. Literally blinked, breaking his eye contact with her.
The audience gasped again, sensing blood in the water.
Crockett leaned in slightly, not shouting, not grandstanding, but her tone sharpened.
I've spent my life standing with people who didn't have power in the room.
And every time, someone told me to sit quiet, to wait, to be patient.
But patience doesn't pay bail. Patience doesn't stop injustice. Patience doesn't protect dignity. Truth does. And that's why your arrogance fails, because dignity will always outlast your smirk. The crowd exploded.
Applause thundered, people rose from their seats, phones shot upward to capture every second.
This was the moment. The clapback.
The knockout line that would live on replay, GIFs, memes, TikToks, and campaign ads. Jeffries tried to interrupt again, but his voice was swallowed by the reaction.
Patel shifted uncomfortably, his bravado evaporating under the weight of the crowd's roar. And Crockett?
She just sat back, calm, letting the wave crash over her.
She didn't chase applause. She commanded it. The cameras caught everything: Patel's fading smirk, Jeffries' faltering mask, and Crockett's unshaken composure.
It was cinematic, the wide shot of the stage, the close-up on her steady expression, the reaction shots of an audience that knew it had just witnessed history. And when the noise finally settled, Crockett delivered the true mic drop. She looked directly into the camera, not at Patel, not at Jeffries, but at America.
If arrogance is all you've got, then you've already lost. Because dignity, truth, and fire will always win in the end. Boom. That was it. That was the blow that ended the match.
She didn't need to say another word.
The crowd leapt again, the sound crashing through the studio like a tidal wave. Patel sat frozen.
Jeffries shifted in his chair, jaw tight, smirk erased.
It wasn't just a clapback.
It was a dismantling, a public unmasking of arrogance, line by line, until there was nothing left but the truth standing tall.
And in that moment, you could feel the shift. Crockett wasn't just a participant in the debate anymore. She was the story. She had seized the narrative, flipped the frame, and etched herself into memory as the woman who refused to bow, who turned arrogance into rubble, who proved that fire and dignity could silence even the loudest stage. Every camera angle, every audience reaction, every gasp and applause would be replayed endlessly. The tweets, the headlines, the commentary, all would orbit around that line, that gaze, that composure. And for Jeffries, the damage was done. The man who prided himself on never being rattled had been rattled on live TV. His smirk was gone. His reputation as the untouchable strategist? Shaken. Patel's arrogance? Flattened. Crockett didn't just win the exchange. She redefined the terms of the fight. But Crockett's takedown didn't end on that stage, it unleashed shockwaves nationwide. The debate may have ended in that studio, but the real explosion happened the moment Crockett's words hit the internet. Within minutes, hashtags began climbing. First it was hashtag Crockett, then hashtag Crockett trend, and within an hour, it had evolved into hashtag dignity wins. Twitter feeds were drenched in clips, quotes, and memes. If you weren't online that night, you weren't part of the conversation. TikTok lit up like a bonfire. Teenagers were lip-syncing Crockett's mic drop line, "If arrogance is all you've got, then you've already lost," pairing it with slow-motion edits, dramatic music, and captions like, "Mood every time someone underestimates me." On Instagram Reels, influencers spliced her words over boxing footage, showing Crockett's composure alongside knockouts in the ring. It wasn't politics anymore. It was culture. Memes poured in by the thousands. Jeffries' smirk became a template, captioned, "When you think you've won the argument but Jasmine Crockett hasn't spoken yet." Patel's frozen face was looped endlessly under the words, "When the clapback is so good you reconsider your life choices." And then there were the edits, black and white slow zooms of Crockett's face, her gaze unblinking, with text overlays, dignity arrogance. Even celebrities joined in. Comedians tweeted one-liners about Patel's face when the thunder drops. Athletes quoted Crockett's line in their victory posts. Pop stars reshared the clip with emojis of fire and crowns. For a brief moment, she wasn't just a politician. She was the internet's main character, the role nobody plans for, but everyone recognizes when it happens. And the commentary machine? It couldn't keep up. CNN replayed the clip with analysts marveling at her control. MSNBC branded it the Crockett moment. Even Fox News, usually hostile, couldn't resist airing it, though with the headline "Crockett goes off." Pundits scrambled to frame it. Was this a generational shift? A style clash? A warning shot to the establishment? Whatever the spin, the verdict was clear: she had won the moment. Late-night hosts built monologues around it. One played the clip 3 times in a row, then looked into the camera and said, "That's not a comeback. That's a public service." Podcasts devoted entire episodes to dissecting the exchange, some calling it the most satisfying clapback in modern politics. Political cartoons sprang up overnight, showing Jeffries' smirk melting under Crockett's gaze. But perhaps the most telling part wasn't just the pundits or the comedians. It was the everyday voices. The barber shops. The college campuses. The group chats. People shared the clip not because it was politics, but because it felt universal. Everyone has faced arrogance. Everyone has been dismissed. And Crockett's response wasn't just about Congress, it was about life. One viral tweet put it best: Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for everyone who's ever been underestimated. That post alone racked up hundreds of thousands of likes, millions of views, and replies filled with stories from people saying they felt seen. The echo chamber didn't just validate her win. It amplified it, multiplied it, burned it into the culture. By the next morning, you couldn't scroll any platform without running into her words, her face, or her fire. Newspaper front pages framed it as a clash of generations. Editorials called it a turning point for political authenticity. Even international outlets picked it up, with headlines in London, Toronto, and Sydney marveling at the Crockett effect. For Jeffries, the optics were brutal.
The man who built his brand on composure had been undone not by shouting, not by chaos, but by a calm, razor-sharp dismantling. For Patel, it was worse.
His insult was now a meme, a punchline, a reminder that arrogance ages poorly in the age of viral receipts. And for Crockett? It was validation, not from pundits alone, but from the people. She had spoken with the voice of her history, her courtroom fire, her unshakable dignity, and the world had echoed back, yes. This is what we've been waiting for.
It was more than a debate moment. It was a cultural moment.
The kind that blurs lines between politics and pop culture, between leaders and legends.
And yet, beneath the noise, a deeper lesson was forming, one that speaks to all of us. When the dust settled, what remained wasn't just a memory of Crockett's sharp words or Patel's fading smirk. It was the unmistakable feeling that something deeper had been revealed. What we had witnessed wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a parable, a mirror reflecting the bigger story of our politics, and maybe even our country itself.
Jeffries' arrogance wasn't unique to him.
It was the distilled essence of establishment politics, the belief that control equals leadership, that patience equals progress, that power belongs only to those who smile while others stay silent. His smirk wasn't just his. It was the smirk of every gatekeeper who has told the next generation to wait their turn.
It was the smirk of every insider who believes access is more important than authenticity.
Crockett reframed that smirk. She exposed it for what it truly was, not wisdom, not discipline, but ego dressed in polished language. And in that moment, she reminded us that arrogance may dominate a room for a while, but it cannot survive when confronted with truth. Because truth, once spoken boldly, has a power arrogance cannot touch.
That's the moral of this story. Arrogance feeds on silence, on our willingness to accept things as they are.
But courage, the kind Crockett displayed, breaks that cycle. Courage refuses to let arrogance stand unchallenged. Courage interrupts the smirk, dismantles the insult, and replaces it with dignity.
And dignity matters. It is not weakness.
It is not passivity. Dignity is strength in its purest form, strength that doesn't need volume to carry weight, strength that doesn't need cruelty to prove power.
Crockett didn't just fight back.
She fought back with dignity, and in doing so, she showed us all that respect doesn't have to be demanded.
It can be commanded by truth.
This is why the moment resonated far beyond one debate. It was about more than Crockett versus Patel, or even Crockett versus Jeffries.
It was about all of us, watching and remembering times we were dismissed, underestimated, overlooked.
It was about recognizing the fire it takes to push back, the courage it takes to hold your ground, the clarity it takes to speak truth when silence would be safer.
The lesson is simple, but powerful. Courage will always outlast ego. Truth will always outshine elitism.
And dignity, when wielded with conviction, will always silence arrogance. That's why people shared the clip. That's why it spread like wildfire.
It wasn't just entertainment.
It was a reminder that leadership isn't about who smirks the loudest, but who speaks the truest.
It was a reminder that courage isn't reckless, but necessary.
It was a reminder that in a world overflowing with arrogance, dignity is still our most revolutionary act.
And so, Crockett's mic drop wasn't just a comeback.
It was a declaration.
A declaration that the days of unchecked arrogance are numbered. A declaration that truth-tellers will not be sidelined.
A declaration that fire and dignity, together, can bend the narrative and light the path forward.
This moment wasn't about the soundbite. It wasn't even about the trending hashtag.
It was about a shift, a cultural, moral, generational shift reminding us that arrogance may laugh, but dignity will always have the last word.
And that's why this moment isn't just about politics, it's about dignity, identity, and the America we choose to build.
And so, we return to the moment that started it all, the smirk, the arrogance, the shocking comment meant to put Jasmine Crockett in her place. But instead of shrinking, instead of retreating, she rose.
She dismantled Jeffries not with cruelty, but with clarity.
She turned his attempted dominance into a masterclass in dignity.
That's why this wasn't just a clapback. It was a turning point.
It was the instant where old guard arrogance collided with new guard courage and arrogance lost. For years, Figures like Jeffries believed they could control the narrative, dismiss the challengers, and hide behind polished facades. But in that debate, Crockett proved something undeniable: truth, when delivered with fire and dignity, cannot be silenced. Her words now live far beyond that stage. They live in the trending hashtags, the memes, the millions of shares. They live in the conversations happening in barbershops, living rooms, classrooms, and communities that know what it means to be overlooked and what it means to finally be heard. And here's the truth: this moment isn't just about Crockett. It's about all of us. Because every one of us will face arrogance, dismissal, or doubt. And when we do, the choice is ours: do we let the smirk stand, or do we meet it with courage, clarity, and dignity? If you believe dignity deserves the last word, share this story. Subscribe. Join us. Because moments like this don't just remind us of what politics can be, they remind us of what America can become when truth tellers refuse to back down.